Jesus Christ. You know the name, of course. He's a figure who has literally shaped the course of human history and billions of lives. But who was he? And I'm not talking about the Sunday school version. I mean the person that scholars are still fiercely debating. So today, we're going to dive right into one of the most explosive questions in all of history.
So here's the big question, right? Was Jesus a real historical guy whose story got, well, let's say embellished over time? Or was he a sacred fiction from the get-go? This is the central controversy. It really gets to the heart of everything: history, faith, and even how we know what we think we know about the past.
Okay, so before we jump into the really wild, radical ideas, let's just set the stage. What do most historians, the mainstream secular ones, actually agree on? Because there is a consensus, and that's where we need to start.
All right, so here's what's really key to get. Most secular historians, and it doesn't matter what their personal beliefs are, they pretty much agree on these basic points. A Jewish preacher from Nazareth, baptized by John, gathered followers, ticked off the authorities, both Roman and Jewish, and was ultimately crucified under Pontius Pilate. The thinking is that a guy named Jesus probably existed, he started a movement, and the Romans executed him. You can think of this as the historical bedrock we're building on.
And it's not just the Bible, right? We actually have a couple of non-Christian sources that mention him, though, and this is important, they were written decades later. You've got the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus. Both of them mention Christ and his execution. And for most scholars, this is kind of the smoking gun, or at least enough to ground him as a real person who definitely made a big splash. But, and this is a huge but, the evidence for the biblical Jesus, you know, the miracle worker, that's where things get way, way more complicated.
Okay, let's flip the script. Now we're going to get into the other side of this whole debate, the mythicist challenge. And this idea is pretty radical. It says that the biblical Jesus, you know, the guy who works miracles, was born of a virgin and resurrected, wasn't a real person at all. Instead, he was a character, a kind of composite figure built from much older myths.
Now, to really wrap your head around this argument, you've got to picture the world back then. The ancient Mediterranean was basically swimming in stories about dying and rising gods. These were divine figures who, die some kind of tragic death and then are miraculously brought back to life. And they usually offered some form of salvation to their followers. This was a super common theme.
And this table just lays it all out, doesn't it? This is the core of the mythicist case. Just look at these parallels. You've got Horus from Egypt, born of a virgin, check. Performed miracles, check. Died and resurrected, check. Then there's Mithras from Persia, who had a kind of Last Supper. Dionysus in Greece also died and came back. When you put them side by side with Jesus, I mean, the similarities are just striking. And for mythicists, there's no way this is a coincidence.
So here's the bottom line for the mythicist argument, summed up perfectly here. Christianity didn't start with a historical guy. It evolved from these mystery cults. The idea is that Christianity wasn't some brand new thing. It was just the next step, an evolution of these pagan mystery cults that were already all over the place. They believe the first Christians worshipped a kind of cosmic spiritual being, not some guy who actually walked around in Galilee. Okay, so this brings us to the main piece of evidence, right? The Bible itself. You'd think if Jesus was a real person, the earliest Christian writings would be packed with details about his life, right? Well, this is where it gets really, really interesting. So, let's get something straight. Before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, before any of the Gospels we know, there were the letters from the Apostle Paul. These were written just a couple of decades after Jesus' supposed death. That makes them our absolute earliest Christian sources. So, what does Paul have to say about the man Jesus?
The answer is shockingly little. I mean, Paul goes on and on about a crucified and risen Christ, but the Christ he talks about is this grand cosmic spiritual figure. He's something Paul learned about through visions in Scripture, not from hanging out with him. He doesn't mention miracles, teachings, Nazareth, a human backstory, the virgin birth, almost nothing biographical. It's a really strange silence. Now, to be fair, mainstream historians have an answer for this. They say, look, Paul wasn't trying to write a biography. He was writing letters to churches to solve specific problems, so a life story just wasn't his point.
But then, decades go by. We're talking 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, and suddenly the Gospels appear. And now we get this incredibly detailed biography. All of a sudden, Jesus has a hometown, he's performing all these amazing miracles, he's giving the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the question mythicists ask. Where did all this new information suddenly come from, so long after the fact?
The mythicist argument is that the Gospels aren't really history books. They're theological arguments. They're designed to prove that Jesus was the Messiah by making his life fit Old Testament prophecies. Why is he born in Bethlehem? Because the prophet Micah said the Messiah would be. The whole virgin birth thing? You could see that as a creative interpretation of a passage in Isaiah. And what's more, the Gospels don't even agree with each other on major details. Just look at the genealogies of Jesus, they're completely different.
And that brings us to what might be the biggest puzzle of all for a historical Jesus: the complete and total silence from everybody else living at the time. I mean, think about it. If a guy was walking around raising people from the dead and feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread, you'd think somebody would have jotted it down, right?
This quote just nails it. If he was raising dead people and eclipsing the Sonic crucifixion, someone would have noticed. And here's a perfect example. There was a guy named Philo of Alexandria. He was a famous Jewish writer, writing tons of stuff about Judea at the exact time Jesus was supposed to be doing his thing. He writes about all sorts of figures from that period, but he never, not even once, mentions Jesus, or his followers, or any miracles. For critics, that silence is just deafening.
All right, so we've laid out two totally different stories here. So what do we do with that? Let's try to bring it all together and look at the two competing theories for who or what Jesus Christ actually was.
So it really boils down to this. On one side, you have the idea of a real preacher, a radical, apocalyptic preacher who got executed, and over time his followers built him up into this divine, mythical figure. On the other side, you have the complete myth theory. This says he started out as an invented composite of older gods, a celestial being who was later historicized, basically given a fake biography to make him seem like a real person. And even within that mythicist view, there's some debate. Some say he was a total invention, while others think maybe there was a real guy, but his story was so buried in myth right from the start that we can never really know him.
Now, it's really important to get this straight. This isn't just a simple believers versus atheists thing. Not at all. You have many secular scholars, like the famous Bart Ehrman, who are totally convinced there is a historical Jesus. But they're also the first to tell you that the Gospels are not reliable history. To use his exact words, they are loaded with legend. Things like the miracles, the resurrection. From a purely historical perspective, that's seen as faith, not fact.
And really, this is the core dilemma, isn't it? History demands evidence, cold, hard facts. But when it comes to the life of Jesus, the evidence we have is, well, it's pretty shaky. It's thin, it was written down late, and it's obviously biased. Faith, on the other hand, it thrives on belief, often without evidence. It just operates on a whole different level. And in this case, the two are just fundamentally in conflict.
So what does that leave us? Real, myth, or something in between? Was he a real man who became a legend? A complete myth that was made to look like a man? Or is the answer something else entirely? The honest truth? Well, we'll probably never know for sure. But the journey to try and find an answer, well, that forces us to ask some really big questions about how we know anything about the past. And that, right there, is a question that is absolutely worth asking.